The Pentagon now requires all military personnel to attest to their COVID-19 vaccination status in accordance with the White House's new guidance. DoD requires those who have not been vaccinated to wear masks, physically distance, and get tested regularly. David Berteau is president and CEO of the Professional Services Council and former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness. Thanks for joining me, David. Let's talk about how this is going to affect DoD contractors. What do you expect?
Well, the guidance, as you called it, is actually not guidance yet, right? What we've had is an announcement, we've had a fact sheet, we've had a white paper, and we've had a series of press conferences. And so from a contractor's perspective, something has to be put in writing and issued by an authority that you recognize, and that has yet to happen. In fact, we've been told by the Pentagon that it may take a week or two for that guidance to be finalized and issued. In the meantime, though, the question of to whom it applies and what it means, those are really key questions. The president's announcement says on-site contractors. There's no technical definition of what's an on-site contractor. Is that a person who's there 5 days a week? Is it a person who goes to a facility occasionally or regularly, but not every day? And how does it apply to contractors who are being sent to multiple facilities? We had one company says, I've got people going to 15 different Army bases in the next 2 weeks. Are they going to have to attest 15 different times? And so these are questions that still remain to be answered. However, the other thing that's not clear is really what's the purpose or the purposes of this announcement and this new guidance. And I think we can interpolate that the idea is to, number one, protect health and human safety. Number two, to reduce the spread of the vaccine by reducing the number of people who have it and therefore the number of opportunities for it to mutate. And then finally, to make it easier to be vaccinated than unvaccinated, because the consequences of not being vaccinated are you're going to have to get tested a couple of times a week.
Right. You sort of hinted at an issue that a company may have where they have they have employees who are on site all the time who may appear clearly covered by this, but then they have other employees who are working out of their offices. Are they going to have, maybe separate or differing policies for these employees? And maybe that's something they already do. What do you expect there?
Well, the White House has attempted to make it clear that each agency has to set up its own procedures here and its own guidance mechanisms, et cetera. In addition, the White House has indicated that they would like this to apply to all contractors, on-site contractors and contractors who work elsewhere. It also says, very interesting wording, independent of geographic location. To me, that implies it doesn't even necessarily need to be a federal facility. It's wherever you're working. This is for federal civilians and for uniformed personnel, as well as for contract employees. All of this remains to be worked out. I think companies would probably prefer to have one set of guidances with which they comply for all contracts, for all agencies, for all circumstances, because it's difficult to manage multiple different rules for your workforce when some people have multiple roles within that workforce.
Sure. What are you hearing from these companies who are, of course, your members? Are they concerned about the logistical challenge, or do they feel like this maybe gives them some cover if they want to require vaccines in their own facilities?
Well, each company has been wrestling itself with the question of what are my requirements for my workforce. I think what this holds promise to do is to create some common ground for all federal contractors across the board. But it only works that way if the government implements it in a way that creates that common ground. If you leave it up to each agency, or in the case of contractors, as you know, Marjorie, oftentimes it's one contract at a time, one task order at a time. That's going to be confusion. That's going to lead to a lot of discrepancies. That's what our companies would like to avoid, and PSC is working on their behalf to do that.
You obviously are sort of hinting at the time frame here. It sounds like you expect this to be somewhat extended. I mean, certainly nothing happens overnight, but it sounds like you think this could take weeks or maybe even months to sort of work out some of the details in individual agencies and contracts.
It's quite possible it could take some time. First of all, attestation requires an actual form that you would fill out. Forms have to be developed and reviewed and approved by form approval processes. Each agency may have its own in this regard. Some agencies may have a head start, others do not. Then there's the question of what do you do with the information? An attestation presumably has to become part of a record, particularly if you're attesting that you have not been vaccinated or you declined to answer. So who owns the database? What goes in it? What do you do with the results? The guidance so far, or at least the commentary so far, doesn't even say what happens if you get a positive result of a test. And these are the kinds of things. I think what our members most want is clarity and understanding and common ground across the board here. I think, though, everybody agrees we've got to do more to beat this coronavirus.
As contracting executives are thinking about this, certainly they've had to come up with some policies themselves over the past year plus. What are your recommendations for them as they kind of encounter this new approach from the federal government?
Well, I think we're giving them a checklist, and we're developing it with our members. In fact, we've got multiple meetings with them over the next few days on this regard of the things that you ought to be taking into consideration. The attestation approach, for example, doesn't require proof of vaccination. You accept people's word, and they affirm that they're telling the truth, right? This gets you around the very, very difficult problem of how do you prove that you've been vaccinated, because it's pretty easy to counterfeit one of those little vaccine cards that so many people have gotten, right? So there are a lot of those kinds of questions that goes into our checklist here. Communicating with your contracting officers and your CORs or your government representatives for your contracts. Planning ahead. We haven't even talked about the travel restrictions that are talked about by the executive branch here. Those travel restrictions are not clear, and in many cases, government agencies are going to err on the side of saying no is a lot easier than saying yes to the wrong person. So those are the kinds of checklist ideas that we give our members to go through. But the biggest thing is opening the lines of communication with all of your contracting representatives.
Thanks so much for joining me, David.
You're welcome.